Well, it's always a challenge to follow Michael Delahoyde. What a wonderful piece of enlightening whimsy there. So what you're looking at is the great estate at Audley End near Saffron Walden in Essex, which houses a library including over 100 Elizabethan-era books on various subjects from literature to statecraft or Roman history. 7 of these books, at least, contain copious annotations in a fine 16th century italic handwriting that are known to relate, especially in 2 of these books, to topics, characters, themes, and action of Shakespeare's Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. Before I go further, let me be sure to credit the trustees of Audley End and English Heritage, which manages this estate, although the books themselves are privately owned. Surprising as it might seem, what you're looking at, the house today is only 1/3 the size of the Jacobean Audley End, which had been enlarged from its Elizabethan footprint by Thomas Howard in 1614, the Earl of Suffolk. He's reported to have spent £200,000 in enlarging this estate, primarily so that he could host King James on Progress. And as many of you may know, in 1578, Queen Elizabeth was on Progress to this location, and that is where Gabriel Harvey recorded his long poems of praise, not only for Elizabeth and Christopher Hatton and Burleigh and the Earl of Leicester, but also to the Earl of Oxford. And that's, of course, Shelley on our trip. And let me also, before I continue, thank the de Vere Society for generously supporting Shelley and I to visit twice in the last 3 years to Audley End to document the materials I'm going to show you. So this is a slide about our methodology. We were following up on a book by Rubinstein and Casson, which had first identified the Shakespearean connections in these books, claiming that the annotations were made by Sir Henry Neville. It was Jan Scheffer, who was here earlier in the conference, who in 2019 came up to me at the Mark Twain House at our conference and said, "Have you seen this book?" He said, "I don't think that those annotations are by Sir Henry Neville. I think they're by the Earl of Oxford." I had not seen the book. So I ordered the book, and within about 10 minutes, I was nodding my head and thinking, I think Jan Scheffer is correct. So we're going to look at 3 key questions here. First, what is the pattern of evidence in these books? Second, what are Shakespeare's sources for his Roman plays? That's going to be relevant. And finally, whose handwriting is in these books? And I'm going to say the least about this third point, and that is because I really want to get you to the meaty stuff, and I'll give you a reference if you want to know more about the handwriting question. So these are the books in question. They include Dionysius' Antiquities of Rome, Cassius Dio's History of Rome, the collected works of Tacitus. These are the 3 most important. And together they cover about 8 centuries of Roman history, from the 7th century BCE to the 2nd century CE. The preview that you see here is kind of just very interesting. It has no direct and obvious connection to Shakespeare, but this says the burning of the library at Alexandria. And that, to me, helps to establish the large sense of history of this annotator. And one might connect this, if one wanted to the fact that, of course, in The Tempest, Caliban's first impulse is to burn Prospero's library. So this is just a quick thematic overview of what we can see in these books. Speeches, characters, letters, messengers, description, law, Roman institutions and offices, theater history, temples, tombs, suicide, wars, marriages, deaths, conspiracies, fathers and sons, hostages, dreams, omens, comets and eclipses, exile, Parthia, poison, flattery, proscriptions, pharmacopoeia, flattery, etymologies, and oh, how about this mistaken identity? So I said we needed to address this question, the three main possible sources for Shakespeare's Roman plays. Everyone knows, of course, that Plutarch's Lives is the most important source for both of these plays. However, there are two other sources that are less well acknowledged. One of them is Appian's History of Rome, which is not one of the books we're going to look at, but also Cassius Dio's History of Rome, which covers the periods of time for both Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. And then Dionysius' Antiquities of Rome is the book that Shakespeare got much of his information about Coriolanus from. These books, so Appian, before I go on, is translated into English in 1578. Cassius Dio was not translated into English until the 19th century, and is said by scholars of that book to still be underappreciated and poorly researched and understood. There is only a little bit of scholarship at this point in time connecting Dio to Shakespeare, although there are at least one or two articles. So I'm about to wrap up my preview here. I said I was not going to say a lot about handwriting, and that's because I have said 18,000 words about handwriting in this publication. Now, how can I write about handwriting? Well, the answer is that over 35 years ago, I was told by my mentor, Mark Schell, at the University of Massachusetts, to become my own handwriting expert. And I have therefore studied Edward de Vere's handwriting and questions of forensic handwriting identification as an amateur, but for many years. And this article was accepted very quickly and without any question about the length, which somewhat shocked me. I sent it out with an apology about how long it was, and they took the whole thing. And we'll talk more in future talks maybe about handwriting, but let's move on to the really fun stuff. So I'm going to cover three things: theater mind, Julius Caesar, and Antony and Cleopatra. So we're going to start with theater mind. Over a dozen annotations contain materials about theaters, actors, theater history, censorship, and treason. And I include treason in this because, as we know, theater is historically a controversial genre, especially comedy, of course. So this annotation says theatrical dispute, and it marks a passage in the Tacitus volume that is about the great pantomime riots, circa 14 and 15 in the Christian era. This is sort of a weird juxtaposition. How can there be a riot about pantomime, right? Well, pantomime actors were famous and could become very wealthy in Rome. And although Augustus Caesar had been a supporter of the theater, primarily because of his friend and supporter Maecenas, after he left and gosh, where do I have it here? The next emperor, which I'm forgetting right now and I didn't put down on my notes, was not that keen about theater, and there was huge disputes at this time about the theater, which resulted in a few years later in 23 CE in the actors being expelled from Italy, which is what this says here. The note says Histrionis Italia Pulsi, actors expelled from Italy. I think they came to Denmark after they were expelled from Italy, at least in Shakespeare's imagination. This is a remarkable annotation. This is about the Roshan law on theater seating. Now, this actually is not in chronological order. This was in 67 BCE, and this law restored for members of the equestrian order, the knights, their traditional right to the first 14 rows in Roman theaters, behind the 4 rows reserved for members of the Roman Senate. Now think about that for a moment for our Shakespeare in a culture at a time when only less than 40 years after his death, the theaters would all be shut down due to the Puritan opposition to the theater. So he's reading Roman theater history and going, I think, if I can imagine what he's thinking here, wow, the senators of Rome had the first 4 seats, and then the knights had the next 14 rows of seating. This says Nero begins the scene at Naples. Nero, as you may know, was an actor. He was also played the fiddle. Nero is mentioned several times in Shakespeare. Most famously, perhaps, that you may recall most easily, Hamlet says, "O heart, lose not thy nature." He's thinking of his mother. "Let not ever the soul of Nero enter this firm bosom." Nero killed his own mother. "Let me be cruel, but not unnatural. I will speak daggers to her, but use none." This is a note about the theater of Pompey, which is actually is named in Julius Caesar when one of the conspirators is told after you have gone and posed this is Cinna, the conspirator, is told by Cassius he's going to go and throw the forged notes in at Brutus's window to convince Brutus to join the conspiracy, because the conspirators feel that they require the authority of Brutus to do what they're about to do. And then he says to Cinna, "That done, next repair to Pompey's theater." So I mentioned there are several books involved here. Most of what I'm going to show you is from Cassius Dio. When we get into the 2 plays in just a minute, everything will be from Cassius Dio. But what I'm showing you here is the type of cross-correlations between the different books, where we see not only is the handwriting the same, but there's a lot of thematic overlap. So in Cassius Dio, we have a note about the theater of Pompeii, and in Tacitus, we have a note about the burning down of the theater of Pompeii. And for the last of my theater mind slides, I want to show you this one. I forgot to mention this. I was going to say at the very beginning. Donald Murray, who is a legendary writing instructor, someone who's written many great books about writing, he says that the best writing leaves out the most good stuff. I don't always live up to that, but I've tried to live up to it in this presentation, and I'm letting you know that there are over 2,000 annotations here, and I'm trying to give you only the quintessence of what is here. This note says, Aemilius Scaurus, having offended Tiberius was a name I couldn't remember, the emperor in the wars of the theater, having offended Tiberius in a certain poem, kills himself. Now, I'm going to come back to this, but I want you all to think for a moment, what character do you think in Antony and Cleopatra is based on this historical character, Scaurus, whom Shakespeare is going to move chronologically way out of time? We'll come back, but think about that. See if anybody can come up with it. All right, Julius Caesar. Dissimulation, characters, the crowning of Caesar on Lupercal, Portia, Antony's funeral oration, the will in Antony's funeral oration, the Battle of Philippi, and suicides. As I mentioned, this is all going to be from Cassius Dio. There are more notes in this book than any of the others by a considerable margin. 1,200 out of somewhat less than 2,000 are in this book. So let's start with Caesar dissimulating. Now, there are whole articles and books written about the theme of dissimulation in Shakespeare, but to give you the Cliff Notes version, how about this? conceal 35 times, dissemble 18 times, feign 29 times, counterfeit 60 times, deceive 88 times. You, if you think about it, will have your own favorites. Hamlet puts on an antic disposition. And how about Richard III, the greatest dissimulator in that play and maybe in all of Shakespeare, who says this, "Because I cannot flatter and speak fair, smile in men's faces, smooth, deceive, and cog, duck with French nods and apish courtesy, I must be held a rancorous enemy." There are many character names in both plays in these annotations concerning Antony. Many of them have this day before them, which means concerning, which I believe could be a basis for a credible argument that he is certainly thinking about characters here. Here we have Casca, and even more dramatically, concerning Gaius Casca, see the annotations in Stephanus. Now, this also, to show you part of the problem of interpretation here, I cannot tell you what book by Stephanus or even exactly who Stephanus is meant, whether that's an author or a publisher, because there are a lot of possibilities. But the point I would like to stress is this is a cross-reference. He's not only collecting data about Casca here in Cassius Dio, but he's cross-referencing that to another volume. This one says, concerning Marcus Brutus, who plots conjuravit against Caesar. And I'm not going to go into the bottom part there because it's a little too complicated, but this is actually very interesting. He's noting that the name of Marcus Brutus is missing from the text here. And then he's writing the name Marcus Brutus in Greek. I didn't say this, let me clarify. The main language of these annotations is Latin, but there's also a lot of Greek here, and the original text is in Greek. Now we are really getting to the good stuff here. You know, of course, that the Casca's account of to Brutus and Cassius of witnessing the attempted crowning of Caesar. This says, Caesar on Lupercalia puts back the diadem placed on his head by Antony in the Capitol. Here we have a character note about Portia, and a little more detail. Portia is the wife of Marcus Brutus and the daughter of Cato. Not only is she described that way in Julius Caesar, but in Merchant of Venice, Bassanio, speaking of Portia's namesake, says, her name is Portia, nothing undervalued to Cato's daughter, Brutus Portia, nor is the wide world ignorant of her worth. Exactly the idea expressed here that Portia's identity is tied up with her relationship to these very powerful and prominent men. How about the funeral oration of Mark Antony? This is one of the most famous speeches in the English language, and it is here identified as a logos epitaphios in Greek, the funeral speech or the funeral oration of Mark Antony for Julius Caesar. One other note that accompanies Cassius Dio's account of this speech says vultus dicam, which means, do you wish that I should speak? If you remember that speech, you may remember Mark Antony saying, will you be patient? Will you stay a while? And then you will compel me then to read the will. Well, the will is also mentioned in another note a few lines later. The people hearing the oration of Mark Antony and the reading of Caesar's last will and testament are again aroused to fury. Now, I have placed the key word testamento in red here to remind me to tell you that there is no last will and testament in Cassius Dio. In fact, it's not in Plutarch. Well, I shouldn't say there's no last will. There's no use of the will in either Plutarch or in the annotated text to arouse the fury of the people. That exists only in the third source, Appian. What I would conclude from that is that the annotator has already read Appian and is in fact actively beginning to fuse his sources in the direction of the final version that he's going to write down and that we're going to read and see performed. Of course, one result of the arousing of the people, this is Shakespearean irony at its greatest. This is in the sources, but we have to wonder, why did Shakespeare focus so directly and insistently on this? The mob kills someone named Cinna, but it's not Cinna the conspirator, it's Cinna the poet. And this says Helvius Cinna, a tribune of the people, killed by the people on account of the homonym of his name. That's homonymia in the note, being the same as another Cinna, a praetor who was one of the conspirators. And we know that the result of all of this, the conspirators have killed Caesar. They have aroused the mob. Well, Mark Antony has aroused the mob in rage against them. And the entirety of scene 4:1 is the conspirators sitting around deciding who else they have to kill. These are called proscriptions. This was a fairly common practice in Rome at the end of a power struggle. People who are on the wrong side, just be killed. That's a good clue that Shakespeare doesn't really approve of any of this. And he has a deep sympathy for Caesar and feels that this extrajudicial execution was a prelude to tyranny and more violence. And of course, that violence is going to culminate in the Battle of Philippi. So we have a note about that. The war at Philippi waged by Octavius and Antony against Brutus and Cassius. And of course, in the course of this war, in the course of this battle, both Brutus and Portia are Brutus. We see him, and then we hear the report of Portia committing suicide. Brutus, by his own hand, kills himself. Portia, his wife, devours hot coals, which is one of the two accounts of how she killed herself here, annotated in Edward de Vere's handwriting in this copy of Cassius Dio. And that concludes my survey of Julius Caesar. I think I'm doing okay on time. I'd like to get through in time to have a few questions, if there are any. So let's talk about Antony and Cleopatra. Now, before we go on, let me say what I've just shown you is a good selection of some of the best annotations concerning Julius Caesar. It is by no means all of them. And the same will be true here. But here we're going to cover Antony's communications with Rome, the death of Fulvia, the Parthian campaign, Antony's envy, the battle of Actium, prodigies, the flight of Antony and Cleopatra from Actium, Cleopatra enclosing herself in her monument and pretending suicide, Mark Antony responding by killing himself and dying in Cleopatra's arms, and then finally Cleopatra meeting with Caesar and Cleopatra's blush. How about that? So, Antony and Cleopatra opens with letters and legates between Alexandria and Rome, and this says Antony sends legates to the Senate. You remember the scene. The scene is him receiving messages back and kind of going, oh, I don't want to do this. I want to keep on partying, okay? I don't want to deal with business from Rome. And the word legate, by the way, the word you see here occurs 9 times in Shakespeare. Here comes the holy legate of the Pope in King John. Also in this first scene, or maybe it's the second scene, we get the account of the death of Fulvia. This says the death of Fulvia. And as you may recall, the messenger tells him, Antony, that Fulvia, thy wife, is dead. And he has this sort of bizarre answer. He says, where died she? I think this is partly Shakespeare's critical view of a serious character defect in Mark Antony. And then we hear, let's see, I have the best version here. A few lines later, Fulvia is dead. Enobarbus says, sir, Fulvia is dead. Fulvia, dead. So this note seems to have furnished a sort of a repeated rhythmical element in the scene. This may be a little bit less familiar, but no less striking. This says in Latin, in the first line, the weapons of the Parthians, and then in the bottom line, in a mixed Latin-Greek expression, it says Parthian horse bowman, epotoxotai. I don't know if I pronounced that correctly, but something like that. Now, how about this? Ventidius, now darting Parthia. Darting Parthia means darts are arrows. Now darting Parthia art thou struck. And now pleased fortune does of Marcus Crassus's death make me the revenger, etc. Then Ventidius says a little bit later, he refers to the ne'er yet beaten horse of Parthia, whom we have jaded out of the field. And finally, in the same play, Eros, who has been asked to slay his master, to commit suicide. Antony, he says, the gods withhold me. Shall I do that which all the Parthian darts, though enemy, lost aim and could not? And this theme of the Parthian horse bowman is even found in Cymbeline, where Iachimo says, arm me audacity from head to foot, or like the Parthian, I shall flying fight. So again, we have a motif in the annotation that has been furnished a repeated imagery in the plays. So as you recall, Antony keeps saying he's going to go to Parthia and fight, and he never does. And he expresses in several occasions his envy of his lieutenants who have fought with success in Parthia. Parthia, by the way, is the eastern edge of the empire, and it was the Vietnam of the Roman Empire. They really, partly because they did not know how to fight effectively against military people on horseback firing arrows at them. It wasn't what they were used to. So this says, Antony, moved to envy at the deeds well done by Ventidius in Parthia, deprives him of rule. Now we have this important woven aspect of this play of Sextus Pompeius and his lieutenants Manus and Menocrates. And Octavius says of Pompey, when asked, how's he doing? He says, great and increasing. But by sea, he is an absolute master. Well, the note here, again, a mixture of Latin and Greek, says Sextus Pompeius is master of the seas. Now, of course, just as we had the major battle in the previous play as a result of ultimately of the assassination, we have here the Battle of Actium between Caesar and Antony, which is what this note says. Now, in Julius Caesar, the battle takes up the entirety of the fifth act. But in Antony and Cleopatra, it is compressed into about 3 very short scenes. And the action itself of the battle is recorded only in 2 speeches by a minor character. Does anybody know the name of that minor character? His name is Scaurus. Spelled without a U, but otherwise exactly the same as the Scaurus that we were just looking at in the note. And it's an invented character, or rather, shall we say, an interpolated character, a character that has been moved. Remember that the Scaurus of the note was a poet who offended Tiberius, so badly that he committed suicide. This is what he says about the battle. He's talking to Enobarbus. On our side, like the tokened pestilence, where death is sure, yon ribodred nag of Egypt. That's Cleopatra. He's speaking of the queen, calling her a nag of Egypt, whom leprosy overtake in the midst of the fight, when vantage, like a pair of twins, appeared. That might be Castor and Pollux, by the way. That might be a reference to that. Both as the same, or rather ours, the elder, the breeze upon her, like a cow in June, hoists sails and flies. And Enobarbus says, that I beheld. Mine eyes did sicken at the sight and could not endure a further view. Scarus, she, once being loofed, the noble ruin of her magic, Antony, claps on his sea wing, and like a doting mallard, leaving the fight in height, flies after her. Shakespeare observed nature very carefully and understood that the mallard actually follows his mate and the chicks, right? That's a defensive position if you're in the water and there's pikes underneath you trying to swallow your chicks, okay? I never saw an action of such shame. Experience, manhood, honor, ne'er before did so violate itself. Now, think of this. This is based on a character who was a poet who committed suicide because he offended powerful people. It fits, right? These curses, these denunciations of both Antony and Cleopatra have been carried over. Prodigies are a major theme throughout Shakespeare. The word prodigia appears 23 times in these notes, portents 9 times, augurs 7 times, and we have dreams, eclipses, and comets also. This just says the flight of Antony and Cleopatra. As we've just heard, they flee from the battle. And then we get to this. It's getting better and better here. Cleopatra, enclosing herself in her tomb, pretends death. Mortem simulat. She pretends to commit death. She pretends to kill herself, which hearing, Mark Antony kills himself. Well, we know he doesn't actually succeed. This is part of Shakespeare's tragic comedy that when Cleopatra commits suicide, she does so in the marvelous Greek-Egyptian style and everything goes perfectly. But Mark Antony, stabs himself, doesn't succeed, has to be hauled up into Cleopatra's monument, etc., etc. And of course, the series of actions described in this note apply not only to Antony and Cleopatra, but also to the denouement of Romeo and Juliet. Shakespeare is fascinated by this ironic pattern of tragic love, where one partner commits suicide thinking the other one has, when she has not actually committed suicide. And of course, after being hoisted up on ropes and pulleys to Cleopatra's monument, Mark Antony in the play and in the notes finally dies in the arms of Cleopatra. After which, Caesar, having effectively won the battle, sends Prochelaus, and in the note, Epaphroditus, I do not think he's in the play, he sends them to her. So this says, Gaius Prochelaus and Epaphroditus, a freedman of Caesar, having been sent to face-to-face conversation with Cleopatra, apprehend her and confiscate. This is the key part. Not only are they sent, but they confiscate anything with which she might kill herself. Charmian, this is in 5:2. O Cleopatra, thou art taken. Cleopatra, quick, good hands, drawing a dagger. Prochelaus, hold, worthy lady, hold. And he seizes and disarms her. Do not yourself such wrong, who are in this conquest relieved, but not betrayed. So finally, here we have stated not only an action, but a motive that is true to Shakespeare's play. Cleopatra fearing that she be led in triumph in Rome, kills herself. And this is not quite in order. I should have reversed the order here. But before she kills herself, after Caesar has sent his messengers to disarm her and make sure she will survive so that he can parade her on triumph in Rome, he comes to speak with her himself. Caesar speaks with Cleopatra. Now let's just, and I'm getting to my last slides here, let's just zoom out here and look at this. You will see that an inch or two below the note about the meeting is a word in Greek which means she blushes. Okay? Cleopatra says to Caesar, you have the world. It's yours. And we, your scutcheons and your signs of conquest, shall hang in what place you please. Here, my good lord, Octavius, you shall advise me in all for Cleopatra. Cleopatra, this, handing him a piece of paper, is the brief of money, plate, jewels I am possessed of. 'Tis exactly valued, no petty things omitted. Where's Seleucus? Seleucus is her treasurer. Here, madam, this is my treasurer. Let him speak, my lord, upon his peril that I have reserved to myself nothing. Speak the truth, Seleucus. Madam, I had rather seal my lips than to my peril speak that which is not. What have I kept back? Enough to purchase what you have made known. At which line Cleopatra blushes. And the only reason we know that she blushes, and blushing, by the way, is one of Shakespeare's his repertoire of showing human emotion in the face or in the body. He's also very fond of weeping, kneeling, all sorts of actions that indicate strong emotion. Octavius says, nay, blush not, Cleopatra. I approve your wisdom in the deed. I would have done the same thing myself. And so there you see Cleopatra blushing. And you see the underlining on the word she blushing in the Greek along with the note. And then just to conclude, there is one other word underlined in this passage about the meeting between the two of them, and that is the word eyelids. Now, there's nothing directly about eyelids in Shakespeare's version of this scene, but here is what Charlotte Spurgeon tells us. Carolyn Spurgeon, not Charlotte. Carolyn Spurgeon reminds us of this in her book on Shakespeare's imagery. The peculiar beauty of the eyelid is a notable aspect of Shakespeare's intense interest in the human face. And my comment in response to that is that a talented actress, I submit, would not need the stage direction implied by the underlined passage. So I'd just like to look forward and, oh good, maybe we have a few minutes for discussion. So the Audley End annotator, identified elsewhere as Edward de Vere, exhibits a wide range of theatrical elements in his notes, some of which correspond in detail to elements from Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. So I'm pleased to be able to say with some conviction now that looking forward, along with the illusion book that Alexander Watt and I have been working on for many years, and the wonderful work that so many of the rest of you have been doing, the Audley End annotations will bring a new level of detail to the study of the authorship question. Think about what's on the other side of this, those 6 signatures. No books, no letters, nothing. They got nothing. This is what we now have. So the more such evidence becomes known and understood, the more glaring the failure of Orthodox Shakespeareans to provide legitimate documentation for their assumption will become. So I'd like to thank the de Vere Society, the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, the trustees of both organizations, also the Cosmos Club in Washington, D.C., which kindly provided me an opportunity to deliver a very similar talk a few weeks ago, and Coppin State University. And I already thanked the English Heritage and Audley End. Shelley, my wife. I think those are the main people I need to remember here. So if you have questions or comments, I would love to hear them.
We have a few minutes for questions.
We have more than questions. We have answers. Roger, there's no one anywhere in this universe that has contributed more. All right, give me the mic here. All right. There's no one that has contributed more to our understanding and broaden our deep, deep appreciation for the work that you than the work that you and of course Alexander have done in so many different ways. In the 25 years that we've been in relationship, I know for sure there is no one that qualifies any greater for what we can confer upon Roger today, and that is the Tom Rainier Veritas Award. He is so worthy of this award, it almost gathered dust waiting for him to show up, you know. I just want to read a little bit about, and for those of you who didn't know Tom, he was the fearless leader, brilliant attorney, guided us, created so many wonderful programs for us, and was the unfortunate early victim of COVID back in 2020. Julie Bianchi, one of our former board members, came up with the idea of creating an award in his honor in the way that we could recognize the kind of contributions that he made and the enduring and persistence of his own vision in doing this. And this is, I'm just going to read from the text of this. To honor his unique contribution to the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship, this award is presented to Oxfordians who best demonstrate through their creative endeavors, dogged scholarship, and overall tenacity the potential to make a lasting impact on the history of the authorship question. Our Veritas Award recipients truly represent the best of the mark and glass, copy and book fashioned by Tom Rainier. Congratulations, Roger.
Thank you very much. It means a lot to me, and I miss Tom a great deal. But I would try to continue on his path. Questions, comments, Joelle? Yeah.
Hey, hang on a second. Don't talk until the microphone.
I'm going to be really embarrassed if you answered this before and it flew by me. Do you have any guess as to how old Edward de Vere was when he did these annotations?
Yeah, I didn't say anything about that. Thank you. That's an excellent question. Unfortunately, I think it's very hard to be very certain about that. However, I will say, since I was focusing here on the theatrical dimension, a very major element in these annotations is the history of law also. I showed you one slide, the Roshan law about theater seating. That one sort of intersects both those categories. But to me, the legal annotations in particular suggest a probability, a pretty good probability, that these would have been done at the time that he was a student at Gray's Inn. And if that is the case, it may mean that they predate certainly the final forms of these plays by some time. But I'm one of the people who thinks that he didn't just sit down and write a play, but that he worked on the ideas of these plays and wrote and revised over a long period of time. So that would be my best guess, but I cannot prove that.
Roger, you are doing this work at Audley End, which is extraordinary. I'm not sure everybody knows the background with Rubinstein and his work there. Bill Rubinstein, an Australian scholar who recently died, wrote a book saying that Sir Henry Neville was the person who annotated all of this material. That's the material that Jan Scheffer said, no, it's de Vere. And in the Journal for Scientific Exploration, we had a major issue a few issues back. Rubinstein responded to that issue and said, this is Neville, I insist that it's Neville. I then answered that in another issue of the Journal for Scientific Exploration, saying, look at the work that Roger has done down there, and this really provides a background why it's de Vere. I wonder if you could just give a short version
Sure.
of what happened there so that everybody understands.
Sure. First of all, well, I'm not going to tell up here the story I have about Bill Rubinstein from 20 years ago because he has passed away. So, I will say he was one of the first people to receive electronic version of this article. He has insisted to me for years that these annotations look, quote unquote, nothing like the Earl of Oxford's handwriting. To dive into a little more detail about the methodology for the handwriting study, I came up with 10 what we called standards. So an example of a standard in handwriting analysis might be slant, okay, the slant of the lettering. And I went through all 10 of the standards that I developed for Sir Henry Neville's handwriting. Only one of them qualified him as the annotator. He does write sometimes a fine italic hand. Normally, Sir Henry Neville more typically actually uses a secretary hand, but in that first standard, it was a match. The 9 others were wildly off, wildly off. I then applied the same 10 standards to with Edward de Vere as a control sample. And then the final thing that I did was to address the very slight discrepancies that might be used to argue against de Vere as the annotator. I mentioned slant. That is the key issue. If I was going to attack my own argument, I would point out to you that the typical slant in Edward de Vere's correspondence is about like that, and the typical slant on these annotations is about like that. It's about 15 degrees closer to upright. I had the advantage then of being able to compare these 2 sets of data to the annotations in the de Vere Bible. And you know what? At least Edward de Vere, I don't know about anybody else, I don't know how far you can generalize this, when he's writing in the confined space of the margins of a book, his handwriting is about 10 to 15 degrees more upright. So, and this was submitted, by the way, to a journal that began as the in-house journal of the Forensic Document Association of America. This is people that are board-certified forensic document analysts. I happen to know the editor because I had published in the same journal before. And in the time between those 2 articles, the editorship was turned over to a new international board of extremely distinguished forensic professionals. The general editor is a Greek lawyer who also holds a PhD in forensic studies. I sent this to Bill Rubinstein, and he changed the subject. So, and some of his followers have since approached me. They don't want to admit that he was wrong. I should say there are a few annotations in these books that are by Henry Neville. I didn't show you any of them, but I can if there is an interest in that at a later time. And the books did pass through his library, apparently. That is not proven, but I'm willing to stipulate that that's the most likely scenario of provenance. Of course, Neville was a confidant of the Earl of Southampton and the Earl of Essex. He spent 2 years in the Tower for his participation in the Essex Rebellion. And those of us that have studied De Vere's biography see him as very close to that group, sort of maybe being the old guy who was kind of sympathetic, but telling them, you know, we have to do this the right way, don't go crazy, but he couldn't keep them out of trouble, basically. So there are many reasons why these books, following De Vere's death, might have found their way into Neville's library. But his annotations are quite distinct from the ones that we're looking at, and they are actually, the other person whose annotations are in the same books is Sir Henry Neville, who was the university intellectual and advisor to the Essex Rebellion. So there's a close connection. As usual, what has happened, the history of these events has been told, and one person has been left out. You know, De Vere he doesn't appear in any of the history accounts of this history. So it appears that through one way or another, the books found their way into Sir Henry Neville's library after De Vere died, or maybe while he was still alive. But Neville lived until 1612. So he outlived De Vere by 8 years. And the books were at Billing Bear at Neville's estate in Berkshire. And then around 1920, they were moved to Audley End because the library at Billing Bear was in a state of disrepair, and there was a fear that the books could be damaged. And so they were moved to a more secure location.
Hi, Roger. What a wonderful talk. And congratulations on the award.
Thank you.
Well deserved. My question is, do you have any idea why he annotated in Latin and Greek rather than English?
Well, that's another excellent question. There is one annotation in English in the Cassius Dio volume. I mentioned to you Shakespeare's attitude towards Caesar, and it says, and this accompanies an account of the killing of the assassination. And it says, without any trial. Without any trial. That's the only passage in any of these books in English. There's a couple in Italian in some of the books, but the only thing in English. The books are written, all these books are in, well, one is in French, but the others are all in Latin or Greek. And these histories of Rome are both in Greek. One of the really shocking things to me about these annotations is how well trained this man was in Greek. I mean, I'm speaking as someone who has been contesting the small Latin and less Greek thing for a long time. His Greek was off the charts. He is correcting misprints in Greek in a book printed by the printer to the Crown of France. Okay, the best printer in Europe at that time. And he's doing comparisons back and forth. So to come back to your question, though, Catherine, it seems to me that he thought in Latin, perhaps almost as fluently as he thought in English, and he also thought in Greek as fluently. That, again, that part of the striking element of the pattern. And I mean to ask some other experts on early modern annotations if this is seen anywhere else, is the way he moves back and forth with complete ease in a single sentence between Greek and Latin. And he does that multiple times. And presumably that's because he has an idea that's a Greek idea in his mind. He doesn't want to give it in translation because it's truly a Greek idea. So does that answer your question? Okay, sort of. It's a start anyway. Yeah.
John, wait, I'll get you the microphone. Oh, sorry.
Have you any idea how Edward de Vere made use of these annotations? I mean, did you just remember it all? I mean, you say you think he made them years before he wrote Julius Caesar and Antony and Cleopatra. How
Well, I
did he
could be
make
wrong
use of
about
them?
that, but well, I don't know. That's an excellent question. If it is correct that they were made some years before, I mean, he may have already been writing the plays, and it may have, he may have worked on them for a long period of time. As I said, the really most dominant continuous element is law. So I do believe that although I've tried to show you that he's reading and annotating as a dramatist, and I think the evidence supports that very strongly, he's also reading as a historian of law, someone who's going to play a significant role in the Elizabethan state in various judicial functions. As we know, he was on the Mary Queen of Scots jury, and I think he was also on the Essex jury. He was on a, this is a little known fact that I only learned as a result of doing this research. He was a member of the triers of petitions in Gascony, which is, of course, given his knowledge of French and his interest in French history, is something that he would have been uniquely qualified for. And I believe it was in 1571, don't quote me, but around then, that he was appointed by the Queen to this important international law body, and he served on that committee until his death in 1604. So he's reading both as a dramatist and someone who's interested in law. That's the best I can do.
No evidence of him going back to anywhere where the books were at another time.
Not that I know of. Yeah, not that I know of.
John.
Did Neville have similar abilities in Latin and Greek? Would that show that it was more likely Oxford?
Again, excellent question. Let me just give a more general comparison first. Oxford's penmanship is remarkable. It is precise. It is rhythmic. It is very beautiful. You cannot say that of Neville except in a very few rare samples. Neville does know Latin. There is one annotation by Neville, I believe it's by Neville, in Greek. Interestingly enough, so one of the books I didn't show you is Thucydides' Histories of the Peloponnesian Wars, which is a book that gives the text first in Greek and then in Latin. And there's not a lot of annotations in it, and they don't relate directly to the Shakespeare canon, which is why I didn't really talk about it. But there are 15 or so annotations in the hand of the Audley End unknown annotator, who I've told you is de Vere, all in the Greek section. And then there are a handful of, about the same number of annotations in Sir Henry Neville's handwriting, all in the Latin section. And there is one word written in Greek. It's the word democracy, or the Greek version of that, and it looks like a child's lettering. The Greek of this annotator is just, he's as much a master of the Greek alphabet and the Greek language as he is of Latin. That is very clearly not the case for these other annotations that I believe correspond to Sir Henry Neville's. Sir Henry Neville was an accomplished person. There's no doubt about that, and he became an important diplomat, and he knew French very well, but he wasn't in the same league as our guy. That's what these books are telling us.
Were there any parallels between the annotations, his strategies of annotation in the Bible, as compared to these annotations?
That's, again, an excellent question. There are certain general characteristics that are the same. For example, the use of underlining in combination with notes. The handwriting is indeed the same. Beyond that, I'm not sure how to address that question. I will say this. There is at least one other book that I'm aware of that unfortunately is of uncertain provenance that I've studied for a long time. And in fact, I received a grant some years back from the Shakespeare Oxford Fellowship to study this book. That is, I'm pretty confident, especially now that we have these Audley End books. Before that, I wasn't totally sure, but now that I have this, I mean, there's probably over 10,000 words in these annotations. Now, to compare that to the de Vere Bible, there's 28 words written in the de Vere Bible. It's very, and my external expert, my board-certified forensic analyst for the de Vere Bible, said in her opinion, in her finding, that she was 95%, she doesn't use that, but that's basically what she's saying, 95% certain that de Vere was the annotator, and the only reason she could not be 100% or close to 100% was that the sample size was too limited. And all of the writing in the de Vere Bible is in English. So in these books, as I've explained, and in the other book that I'm mentioning now, the writing is all Latin and Greek. And we do see in that other book the same mingling of Greek and Latin in the same sentence. So there's another step once I get this kind of like really better, you know, presented than it is yet. I'm going to go on and we're going to talk about that book as well. So I would say, in answer to your question more directly, the comparison between those two sets are stronger than between either one in the Bible, partly because of the language issue, and partly because in both cases we have much larger sample size.